The wrench slipped from my fingers and clanged against the porcelain sink, echoing like a small bell inside an empty church. I was crouched under the counter, tightening the loose pipe for the third time that month, when the phone rang. Sharp, metallic, urgent. "Mr. Lane, your 401k account shows a zero balance." The voice on the other end was flat as a winter lake. For a second, I thought the line had cracked. Then my heart did. A lifetime of oil-stained overalls, of paychecks saved instead of spent, had just vanished into silence. I gripped the cold edge of the counter. The formica felt like ice under my palm. "That's impossible! How?" My voice was barely louder than the dripping faucet beside me. A drop fell, then another, ticking like a countdown. Money is supposed to be a wall that keeps the storms out, I thought. But what if it was just a paper umbrella all along? This wasn't just a financial error. It was the first crack in what I never imagined could become a family drama. Before you continue, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where and when you're watching. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted long stripes across the kitchen linoleum, but inside everything felt dim. The house on Oak Ridge Drive had never been loud, but now it was unbearably quiet, like it was holding its breath with me. Linda was out at the library. Sophie wouldn't be home from school for another hour. It was just me, the wrench on the floor, and a hollow ringing in my ears. And behind that ringing, a single rising question. Who could have done this? My name is Robert Lane. For 37 years, I rode steel platforms that rose out of the Gulf of Mexico like rusted skeletons, drilling into the earth while waves slapped against the pylons below. Each shift was 12 hours of salt wind, rattling chains, and the smell of crude baked into my skin. I missed birthdays, first steps, and quiet Sundays, but I told myself it was for the future. That future, until yesterday, was worth exactly $120,000 in my 401k. Now it was worth nothing, and somehow the silence in my kitchen was louder than those offshore storms ever were. Linda, my wife, is 66. She still works 3 mornings a week at the tiny public library on Oak Ridge Drive, cataloging books for $9 an hour. She hums to herself when she alphabetizes the biographies, and I've always thought that hum was the sound of safety. And Sophie, our granddaughter, is 10. Every Friday after school, she runs across the front lawn shouting, "Grandpa, I'm here!" like she's breaking through the tape at a race. I had planned to use part of that 401k to pay her college tuition someday. Yesterday, I sat at the kitchen table and whispered to her school photo, "I was saving it for you, so you'd never have to start the way I did." But now the frame just stared back at me, mute. I keep asking myself, was this loss just numbers, or the collapse of everything I believed family meant? Maybe that's the cruelest part of deceit. It doesn't just steal what you have. It steals what you thought was safe. Our house on Oak Ridge Drive is made of red brick, the kind that holds summer heat long after the sun has gone. On quiet afternoons, it hums softly like an old record player, spinning memories even when no one's listening. I built shelves into the hallway closet years ago, thinking I was building order. One shelf for Linda's library pay stubs, one for Sophie's report cards, and one, always the heaviest, for our future. That shelf holds a fireproof lockbox, black and square, the size of a small microwave. Inside it, layered in manila folders, are the brittle echoes of my working life. Every quarterly statement of my 401k from Summit First Bank. I slid the newest statement out that morning, just to see if it would say something different now. It didn't. $118,632, I whispered. The number sat there, printed in neat serif font, pretending to still exist. The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust, as if it knew it was lying. Linda found me standing in the hall, holding the folder like it was a baby bird. "Robert," she said gently, "you've read those statements more than the Bible this year." I tried to smile. At least the Bible hasn't disappeared overnight. Her face winced, then softened. She reached for my hand, but I had to put the paper back before it disintegrated under my fingers. Money, I've realized, is a strange kind of ghost. It's everywhere when you don't need it, and invisible the moment you reach out. And now, in the dim closet light, I felt the air grow heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. How could something I counted on for decades vanish without leaving even the sound of footsteps behind? It came to me the way an old injury comes back during rain. Quiet, sudden, and undeniable. One small detail I had buried under the weight of habit. Months ago, during one of his visits, I had handed Ethan Lane my 401k login information. "Just in case something happens to me," I'd said, sliding the yellow post-it across the table while Sophie was in the backyard drawing chalk suns on the driveway. He had smiled, that quick, polite smile, and tucked it into his wallet without a word. At the time, it had felt like passing him an heirloom watch, something meant to outlive me. Now it felt like I had given him the keys to a vault and turned away. I sat down at the kitchen table, the wood worn smooth where decades of elbows had leaned. The late light coming through the window stained the surface a dull copper. I dialed his number with hands that felt too big for the buttons. "Ethan," I said when he picked up, my voice lower than I intended. "Do you know anything about my account?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches like wire pulled too tight. "I can check for you, Dad," he replied. His tone was easy, practiced, like a man offering to water your plants while you're away. "Please," I whispered. Then came the sound I didn't expect. Not an answer. A click, the hollow finality of a call ending. The screen showed "Call ended, 023. The quiet that followed wasn't the kind that soothes. It was the kind that waits. I stared at the blank phone screen until my own reflection surfaced on it, creased, gray, and uncertain. Had I made him into something he never wanted to be? Or had he always been, and I just hadn't looked close enough? Outside, the sprinkler ticked across the lawn, slow and methodical, as if nothing had shifted at all. But inside, I knew something had. The first crack had formed. The story still has many unexpected twists. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss them. The kitchen clock glowed 2:17 a.m. in soft green light, the only pulse in the dark. I sat alone at the dining table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The leather of my wallet lay open before me, empty like a mouth that had nothing left to say. All those years, saved only to be emptied out like crumbs. The words slipped out before I could catch them. They didn't echo. They just sank. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady and indifferent. I kept seeing numbers in the air, faint and ghost-like. $600 a month for Linda's prescriptions, $200 for Sophie's school supplies, $1,100 for property taxes in Houston. Numbers that once marched neatly inside spreadsheets now spun around like loose nails on a rattling deck. Linda's footsteps creaked down the hallway. She wore her old gray robe, the one with the frayed cuffs. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes soft but sharp enough to cut through the dark. "Robert," she said quietly, "come back to bed." "I can't," I replied. "How do I tell Sophie that the future I promised her just vanished?" Linda came closer, pulling the robe tighter against the chill. "We'll get through this," she whispered. "But you don't have to carry it alone." I wanted to believe her, but belief is a bridge. And tonight it felt like the river beneath had swallowed half its pillars. I stared at the empty wallet again. Was this the price of love? That one person's mistake could drain the reservoir meant to hold us all afloat? Outside, the street lamp flickered against the window pane, blinking like a tired eye. Inside, the house seemed to lean forward, listening. And somewhere, beyond the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock, I thought I could hear the future cracking. Jackson Miller worked like someone diffusing a bomb, except he chewed mint gum and played soft jazz from his phone while doing it. Lines of code rolled down his screen like green rain while I sat across from him, pretending my trembling hands were just from too much coffee. "People think money disappears," he said, eyes never leaving the screen. "But money's like a drunk uncle. It always leaves footprints." I almost smiled, almost. Carla called halfway through, her voice brisk. "Robert, I told you he's good. Just ignore the music. It makes him faster, apparently." Jackson waved a hand without looking up. "Tell her it makes me charming, too." 47 minutes later, he stopped typing. His chair creaked as he leaned back, the smirk already blooming on his face. "Got it." My heart kicked once, hard. Got what? He spun the laptop toward me. A string of numbers filled the screen, punctuated by words I only half understood. Transaction IDs, routing paths, timestamps. But even through the fog of jargon, one number shone like a cruel little lighthouse. $110,940. Withdrawn at 2:42 p.m. from an IP registered to Luna Coffee, 3425 Westheimer Road. Luna Coffee? I blinked. That's where Ethan works part-time, Jackson finished for me, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, surprised? Because I'm not. It was a strange kind of pain, like watching your own shadow stab you. I could picture him behind the counter, wearing the black apron, smiling at customers while secretly pulling the floor out from under my future. Could it be someone else using his login? Maybe a shared Wi-Fi, I started, grasping at air. Jackson's tone softened just slightly. Mr. Lane, the system tagged the device as his personal laptop. Same MAC address from his payroll login at the cafe. I swallowed hard. It felt like trying to force down gravel. Print it, I said. Every line. I want it on paper. Paper can't vanish when someone clears a browser history. He gave a small, almost respectful nod. And for the first time in days, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt like the air before a storm. Robert Lane sat in Carla's office, while the clock on the wall dragged its hands like a man pulling luggage through mud. The papers she had prepared. Fraud report, digital logs from Jackson Miller, and signed affidavits were stacked in front of her, tidy as gravestones. She pushed them across the polished oak desk toward him. Once I file this, she said, slipping on her reading glasses, there's no turning the river back upstream. Robert nodded. His throat felt lined with sand. Do it. She picked up her phone and called. Her tone was as calm as weather on a postcard. Yes, this is Carla Monroe. We're submitting evidence of unauthorized federal retirement account withdrawal, case potential for financial fraud. Yes, client is present. The world seemed to hold its breath. 3 days later, 2 black sedans pulled up outside Robert's red brick house on Oak Ridge Drive, just as the sprinklers hissed across the lawn. Agents from Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped out, all dark suits and clipped syllables. Linda ushered Sophie upstairs, murmuring something about coloring books. At the dining table, Ethan sat across from the lead investigator, a woman named Marisol Vega, who laid the printed bank logs out like surgical tools. Mr. Lane, she said evenly, you are aware this constitutes unauthorized access to a federal retirement fund? Ethan's knuckles went white against his knees. He didn't look at anyone, especially not at Robert. Answer her, Robert said, his voice flat as slate. Ethan's lips barely moved. Yes. Were you coerced? Vega asked. No, Ethan whispered. Vega's pen scratched against her pad. Then you understand the penalties can include restitution, probation, and federal monitoring? He gave a single nod, small and fragile, like a candle in wind. Robert watched his son sign the statement with a hand that once built model airplanes on this very table. Now that same hand was confessing to tearing the scaffolding out from under his father's old age. How do you mourn someone who's still sitting in front of you? Vega collected the papers, slid them into a folder, and stood. We'll be in touch. Mr. Lane, she said to Robert. Thank you for cooperating. It's not easy to pursue justice this close to home. Robert almost laughed at that. Justice didn't feel like justice. It felt like shoveling dirt onto your own roots. The door closed behind them, leaving only the smell of Linda's tea and the echo of Ethan's silence. The story is slowly revealing its deepest secrets. Subscribe now to follow it all the way. Robert Lane woke to the sound of his phone buzzing like a trapped wasp on the nightstand. The screen was lit with a news alert from the Houston Chronicle, and for a second he thought it must be some glitch. Then he saw the headline stretched across the screen. Father files fraud complaint against his own son over 401k theft. The words didn't blink or blur. They just sat there, heavy as wet cement. By the time he reached the kitchen, Linda was already at the table, the paper version spread open in front of her like a wound. The black and white photo of Ethan, smiling faintly, taken from his old high school yearbook, sat above the article, framed by words like embezzlement and betrayal. Linda's eyes were red. They printed his name, Robert. They printed the truth, he said, though it tasted like rust in his mouth. She pressed her palms to her forehead, shoulders shaking. Are you sure? This is what you want? Turning our lives into headlines? I didn't choose that, Robert answered quietly. I chose not to drown in silence. Outside, a delivery truck rattled down Oak Ridge Drive, its brakes squealing like some off-key violin. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started, cheerful and oblivious. The world kept spinning, annoyingly casual about collapsing families. He looked at Linda, the woman who had shared 50 years of dinners, winters, and doctor's appointments with him, and felt something crack again. She wasn't just crying for Ethan. She was crying for the scaffolding of their family, now splintered under public eyes. Maybe this is what family drama truly is, he thought, when private wounds get dragged into daylight and strangers point at the blood. Linda folded the paper slowly, like she was burying it. What will people think? She whispered. That I did what a father had to, he said. Not what a father wanted to. And then he stood there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, realizing how loud justice can sound when it comes at the cost of love. Robert Lane had been in courtrooms before. Jury duty, once for a parking dispute, but the one inside Harris County Courthouse felt carved from ice. The air conditioning hummed with surgical detachment, and even the wooden benches seemed to flinch at noise. He sat behind Ethan Lane as deputies led him in, wrists chained loosely in front, the faint rattle echoing off the stone walls. Ethan's suit was too big, borrowed. The sleeves swallowed his hands. He didn't look back, not even once. Linda was beside Robert, clutching a crumpled tissue like it was the last thread holding her to gravity. The clerk read out the charges: unauthorized withdrawal, digital fraud, federal retirement theft, and each word landed like a gavel in Robert's ribs. The judge, Margaret Holloway, adjusted her glasses and fixed Ethan with a stare that could sand paint off a door. Mr. Lane, she said, her voice sharp, but not unkind. Do you have anything to offer this court in your defense? The silence stretched. Somewhere a fluorescent light buzzed. Ethan's lips moved. Only regret, he said. The words were so small they almost didn't make it to the microphone. Robert closed his eyes. He remembered Ethan at 7, standing on this same carpet of years, holding up a handmade card that said, "Best Dad Ever," in blue crayon. The memory felt cruel now, like watching sunlight fall on a locked door. The prosecutor spoke of intent, of breach of trust, of the damage done. Carla leaned forward beside Robert, murmuring legal points, but they slid off his ears. He watched Ethan's shoulders, once proud and straight, now bowed like a tent with broken poles. Is this what accountability looks like? Or just the ruins of love dressed in formality? Judge Holloway tapped her pen once, a muted gunshot. This court will adjourn for sentencing deliberation, she said. Mr. Lane will remain in custody. As the deputies rose, chains rattling softly, Ethan finally turned his head just enough to meet Robert's eyes. There was no defiance there, only the pale flicker of someone who had mistaken recklessness for hope and lost both. Robert stood as they led his son away, the courtroom swallowing the sound of his footsteps like snow swallowing rain. Robert Lane sat in the same stiff wooden bench as the verdict was read, the courtroom air dry enough to crack paper. Ethan Lane stood at the defense table, pale and hollow-eyed, his borrowed suit now wrinkled like it had aged alongside him. The gavel came down with a single clean strike, the sound echoing like a dropped stone in a well. Restitution of $119,940, Judge Margaret Holloway declared. 3 years supervised probation. mandatory enrollment in a gambling recovery program, travel restricted to Harris County. Any breach, and the court will revisit this sentence. Linda exhaled a sob that seemed pulled from somewhere beneath her ribs. Carla, still as a metronome beside Robert, whispered, "Not everyone gets the chance to crawl back from the edge." Robert nodded but said nothing. His chest felt like a vault someone had emptied and left ajar. The deputies unclipped Ethan's cuffs, and the faint click sounded more final than metal should. He rubbed his wrists, avoiding everyone's eyes, as if shame had become a second skin. This was supposed to feel like victory, Robert thought. But maybe there are no winners when deceit lives under your own roof. Carla gathered her files, the edges of the folders whispering against the table. "He pays it back, every cent," she murmured. "And maybe someday this becomes just a scar, not an open wound." Robert watched Ethan sign the restitution agreement, each stroke of his pen slow and deliberate, like someone writing an apology he knew would never be enough. The courtroom emptied, footsteps fading one by one, until only the three of them remained, father, mother, son, standing in the wreckage of what used to be trust. Robert Lane stood at the counter of Summit First Bank, like a man picking up a package that had been lost at sea. The teller, too young to remember a world without smartphones, handed him the receipt with the smile of someone returning a dry cleaning slip, not a piece of a man's soul. "Balance restored," she chirped. 119,940. Robert nodded. "Good. I was worried it might have run off again for another cappuccino at Luna Coffee." She blinked, unsure if that was a joke. It was. Mostly. Outside, the August sun baked the hood of his old Ford Crown Victoria as he sat in the parking lot and logged into the account on his phone. The numbers stared back at him, whole again, as if nothing had ever cracked. Like a liar trying to smile. He withdrew $10,000 and opened a new custodial savings account under Sophie Lane's name. The banker printed the new paperwork, the crisp pages still warm from the machine. Robert ran his thumb across the embossed seal like it might burn him if he pressed too hard. When he got home, Sophie was sprawled on the living room rug coloring a picture of a castle. Crayons scattered around her like fallen soldiers. "Grandpa," she said without looking up, "can I make the princess have purple hair?" "You can make her ride a dragon if you want," he replied, kneeling beside her. He held out the new folder with her name stamped across the top. "I made something for you." She opened it, frowned at the dull black and white numbers and said, "It's not as pretty as my castle." "It's better," Robert said softly, "because this will help you build a real one someday. And you'll never have to gamble for the bricks." Sophie tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled, though it trembled. "Just this. You'll never have to wager love to earn it." She grinned, unbothered by the weight she didn't yet understand, and went back to coloring. Robert stayed there a while, watching the soft scratch of crayon on paper, thinking how strange it was that something as small as a savings account could feel heavier than all the years he'd spent on the rigs. It wasn't just money anymore. It was proof. Fragile, flickering proof that some things could be rebuilt, even after the storm. The most dramatic part is still ahead. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join me to the very end. Robert Lane sat on the front porch as dusk settled over Houston, the air carrying that faint tang of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. The boards beneath him creaked softly when he shifted, like they were listening. Beside him, Ethan Lane sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the cracked walkway as if it held answers. They had been quiet for nearly 10 minutes, the kind of silence that grows roots. "Dad?" Ethan's voice cracked on the first syllable. "I'm sorry." Robert kept his eyes on the yard. The sprinklers clicked on next door, their rhythmic hiss sounding far too cheerful for the wreckage between them. "Sorry," Robert repeated, rolling the words slowly like a stone in his mouth. "That's where people like to stop. Like dropping a bandage on a broken bone." Ethan swallowed hard. "Then what do you want me to say?" Robert turned to him at last, the porch light cutting sharp shadows across his lined face. Not say, do. Sorry is the start. Action is the proof. The words hung between them, heavier than the humid air. A moth batted itself against the porch bulb, stubborn and clueless. Robert almost envied it. You know, he said after a moment, voice quieter, when you were a kid, you'd crash your bike and swear you'd never ride again. I'd set it upright, grease the chain, and wait. You always came back out, always tried again. Ethan gave a soft, bitter laugh. Guess I stopped getting back up somewhere along the way. Then find your way back, Robert said simply. For the first time, Ethan met his eyes, and Robert saw something fragile flicker there, like the first light after a long power outage. He wondered if that was how trust repaired itself, not with grand gestures, but with small, stubborn returns. Maybe this was how family drama could bend instead of break, Robert thought, if both sides decided the story wasn't over yet. The street lamp hummed to life as the sky turned indigo. They sat there in the glow, two men on a porch, trying quietly to rewrite the ending. Robert Lane sat at the kitchen table late that night, the only light coming from the small lamp Linda kept by the phone. Its yellow glow pooled across the wood, like memory made visible. Ethan Lane was upstairs, finally asleep, or at least pretending to be. The house felt like it was holding its breath, unsure if it could exhale again. Robert traced a finger along the ridges of his calloused palm, as if the story of his life might be carved there. You know, he said softly, though no one was in the room. It took me 37 years to build what you erased in 3 clicks. He could still smell the salt when he closed his eyes. The rig out on the Gulf of Mexico had swayed like a drunk giant in the storms, each wave big enough to swallow a house. He remembered the roar of metal cables straining in crosswinds, the nights when lightning stitched the black water, and he'd think, one more hit, and we vanish. Every drop of sweat turned into balance sheet numbers, he had told Ethan once when the boy was 12, showing him a pay stub like it was a trophy. Every hour meant something. Now he wondered if that had been a lie. When the hurricane came, Hurricane Ike, 2008, the wind ripped one of their cranes clean off and hurled it into the sea. Robert had hung on to a support beam as the deck tilted, the world turning into white noise and black water. The company logged it as downtime, as if he hadn't felt death breathe against his ear. He'd gone back out 2 days later. Men like him always did. And for what? So that decades later, his own son could gut the account as casually as emptying a vending machine? He laughed then, dry and sharp, startling himself. It wasn't joy. It was the brittle humor that comes when grief puts on a clown mask. Guess I should have just played poker with the waves, he muttered. They were more honest than family. He caught his reflection in the darkened window. Older, heavier, his shoulders bent, as if he were still bracing against wind. Was this what fatherhood becomes? Trading your body for numbers and hoping love doesn't spend them faster than you can earn them? Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Maybe Ethan couldn't sleep either. Robert switched off the lamp, the light collapsing into shadow, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Next time, son, build something. Don't just take." Ethan Lane started showing up at Luna Coffee again, this time in clean shirts and without the easy swagger that used to hang off him like a loose jacket. He clocked in on time, swept floors, and handed out lattes with a politeness that seemed stitched together from apology. Every Friday, he met Carla Monroe at her office with a thin folder of pay stubs and budget sheets, letting her flip through them like a teacher checking homework. "Slow," Carla said once, tapping the paper. "But steady. Keep it that way." Ethan only nodded, like someone trying not to jinx a fragile truce with the world. Robert Lane watched it all from a distance, the small corrections, the tiny bricks of effort stacking where the crater had been. It was strange how redemption didn't arrive like fireworks. It came like moss, quiet, persistent, neat. needing time more than sunlight. One evening, they sat together on the porch again. The air carried the smell of honeysuckle from Mrs. Collins's yard, sweet and sharp, like hope pretending it wasn't nervous. Ethan rubbed his hands together. "I know I can't make it like it was," he said. Robert looked at him, not smiling but not hard anymore either. "We can't go back," he said, "but we can start again." The porch light flickered on as the sky bruised into violet. Robert thought of how trust was like that bulb, burned out once, but still willing to glow if you changed it gently. Maybe this was the only way to outlive a family drama, he thought. Not by erasing what happened, but by daring to plant something on the ashes. They sat without speaking for a while, two men bound by the quiet math of second chances, as the cicadas hummed like a clock promising there was still time. Robert Lane sat on the porch as the sun sagged low over Houston, turning the red bricks of the house to soft gold. Sophie Lane was chasing soap bubbles across the yard, each one catching the dying light and vanishing before it touched the grass. Linda laughed softly from her chair, knitting half forgotten in her lap. Robert watched the bubbles drift and thought about how fragile they were, and how beautiful, like trust, like time. He had spent decades trading his bones for paychecks, thinking the real inheritance would be numbers on a statement. And yet here was Sophie, squealing with delight at bubbles, utterly untouched by ledgers or balance sheets. He thought of Ethan Lane, now working steady shifts and sending Carla his monthly reports like clockwork. They weren't healed, not yet, but there were stitches where the tear had been. The silence between them had thinned, enough that words could walk across again. Robert leaned back, the porch boards groaning beneath him, and let the warm light pool across his knees. "Money is a tool," he murmured, mostly to himself. "Not an ending. Recovery isn't about numbers returning. It's about trust being rebuilt." For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It just breathed, quietly, as if it had forgiven them all. Maybe that was the true escape from any family drama, not erasing the cracks, but learning how to live gently with the lines. He smiled as Sophie burst a bubble on her fingertip, laughing as if she'd caught the sun. The sound threaded through the fading light, stitching the day shut. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about it in the comments below. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching, and may you have good health and warm days with the ones you love. In our next story, we'll step into another hidden corner of family history, where an old letter could change everything.